Due to the problems with my last game regarding sprite collision, I decided to save the art style and final assets for later, and to focus on the movement and mechanics. I thought that good mechanics would result in a fun game, so I began researching on different mechanics and how to implement them into the game. My initial plan was to have the player move around the world with no arms. Instead, his arms would be a weapon whose direction was controlled by the player's mouse. I also added a grappling hook mechanic that would allow players to do interesting parkour-like movements in the game world. I thought that this would give the player freedom and excitement when moving around. Next, I wanted to focus on different types of combat for the player, so I created 3 gun types and pickups that the player could use, each with another damage and fire rate level. I created a pistol, machine gun, and shotgun. I looked into different animations for the projectiles and added throwable grenades to the game. After working on the player combat system, I decided to go about creating an enemy and a combat AI for them. My first iteration of enemies wandered around and damaged the player upon touch. Later iterations had a gun of their own that functioned like the player's, hanging off their body, and it was guided toward the player once close enough. Although at this point I did not have the final message decided upon, I was sure that I wanted my game to take place in an urban setting. So, once I had the enemies and a player character, I began to build a skeleton of the city and the levels that would be in my game. At this time, I also created blocks that could be destroyed by the player. After playing around in the levels that I had created, it became apparent to me that I was going to have to change up the enemies. The way that the gun pointed around in weird angles on their bodies just looked wrong, so I decided to use zombie-like enemies instead of the enemies that would shoot at you. This would increase the visual cohesiveness of the game and reduce bugs. Next, I focused my time on the main player sprite. I added a mask to him and created new guns and grenades. In order to better suit the gritty aesthetic of the game, I eventually came to the decision to scrap my current player and weapon mechanics in favor of a static weapon that would better suit the visuals of the game rather than the maneuverability of the gun. Once the player sprite was finalized, I focused on the enemy sprite. I found an intimidating looking zombie image online, and using a tutorial I found, I animated the new zombie character. Next, I created and found new assets to use for the building that match the overall darker and more serious aesthetic of the player and enemies as compared to the original versions. Next, to make combat more enjoyable in the game, I decided to animate and create an event for when the player and enemies die. This involved creating an object that appears to fly backwards when hit. At this stage, I added particle effects for blood and for when the player's bullets hit any solid environment objects. I also created a room to go to once the game is lost. I decided to create attack animations and instances for my player and zombie characters. The zombie character was difficult because in order to make it appear natural, I had to create a separate object that would attack and then revert back to the original object before attacking again. For the player, it was a simple animation that played when the gun object was active. To further enhance the behavior of the zombies, I added code so that every game frame, if the player is within a 150 pixel radius, then the zombies would follow him and attack him. I polished the damage system so that if the player lost HP, he would be knocked back and a white shader would appear. I also created a system to randomize the health and speed of each zombie. At this point, I decided to salvage the work I had done on the many different weapons in order to convert the gun pickups into power-ups. Once I had created health and grenade power-ups, I created a functioning health bar that displays your player's current health on a bar that is 100 pixels long. The player loses a pixel for each health point that they lose in-game. Now, I began to focus on the narrative aspects of the game. I created an object that would allow me to create cutscenes for each piece of story that I wanted to tell. It allowed for a player to get the message of my game, but also allowed them to skip if they only wanted to play. This involved writing dialogue for the characters, as well as the narrator, and creating and searching for new art to be used in the cutscenes. My project is called Posthuman, as in the world after humans are gone. My game is a 2D cyberpunk dystopian platformer set in the fictional Golden City in the year 2075. Although this version of the future has flying cars, it also has complete environmental collapse. The player character is an unnamed super soldier developed by the government. In the game, a new strain of virus that was released due to the melting of the polar ice caps has infected the population and turned them into zombies. The premise is that the player must venture into the city to retrieve a sample from a team of researchers that will supposedly help in creating a vaccine to save the city and the world. After the opening cutscene, the soldier is suited into their armor and released into the training ground. On the training ground, he learns about this special ability, like his grappling hook that he can use to traverse the landscape. Once the player has finished the tutorial, they can get to the soldier's hoverbike and ride into the city. In the first level, the soldier is dropped off right in the downtown of Golden City. It is a very chaotic scene. Overhead, flying vehicles flee the danger of the city, while on the ground, police cars are on fire and the only things on the street want to kill you. At the end of the level, you board a hoverbike to follow the trail of the researchers. In the second level, your player crash lands close by to where the team was last heard from. You must use your superior climbing and grappling hook abilities to traverse the dangerous sides of the building. You must avoid both zombies and the flying vehicles whizzing by you. At the end of the level, you find the team's research. At the end of the game, your character has stopped the outbreak that has occurred in the city. However, not all is well. The outbreak in the game is just a symptom of a bigger problem. Humans have been poisoning the earth, and it is too late for anyone to stop that impending disaster. For too many years, blind eyes were turned while the earth was polluted. The message of my game is that global warming is a serious matter. Although the situation in the game may be hyperbolic, the danger is real, and we will begin to see the effects more and more during our lifetimes. My game is a cautionary tale of the disaster that occurs when the planet is not cared for due to the short-sightedness of mankind.